Hello, everybody, and welcome to On the Pulse with myself, Tailgunner. And today we're going to be addressing a highly sensitive and complex issue, that of policing and police brutality. So, first of all, let's maybe start with thinking about how this term police brutality became popularized. If we think about how it's been largely associated with the Black Lives Matter movement and how they've been spotlighting how police departments have been functioning in America, um, we can say that although it has gained a lot of traction and momentum through the US, we know that this is quite a transnational movement. Um, but specifically in reference to the movement in the US, the activism there has been around campaigning and and looking at how the policing system in the US can be overhauled. And as we know, the policing in America is largely decentralized. And what does that mean? It means that each city manages their own force. And so if they decide to bring about some police reforms, that would be entirely dependent on the city itself and how it implements them. And although it's quite decentralized, we can try and unpack and look at how that policing system in the US can have some similarities to South Africa and the region of sub Saharan Africa. What's problematic about the policing system in the US, aspects such as racial profiling, of how there have been so many injustices that have been committed against specific communities, specifically the Black community. Just to mention some of the cases, in 2013, you had an unarmed Trayvon Martin who was shot by George Zimmerman, who later was acquitted of that or those charges. You've got other victims of police brutality in the US, such as Eric Garner in 2014 in Staten Island, who was choked to death. You've got a Michael Brown in 2014 who was killed in Ferguson. Philando Castile in 2016 in Minnesota. And some of the more recent cases were, cases such as Breonna Taylor, which just shows you that this has not largely been just an attack on black males in the US, but also women as well. Breonna Taylor was basically killed in her apartment in Louisville on March 13, 2020. And another more recent case, which became a much more global phenomenon, was that of George Floyd. And this is what popularized also the term "I can't breathe," which has been used quite a lot in the movement, in the Black Lives Matter movement. But now let's move from the hostility and the critique towards policing in America, and let's look at policing in South Africa. So, if we look at the history of policing in South Africa, we know that there are a lot of issues that were related to the apartheid state and how. Then it was known to be quite a police state and a militarized state in terms of how it implemented control over over citizens, control in specific areas, partly where how certain communities, particularly black communities, have been contained by the state or have been controlled by the state. Police violence continues to be a major problem in democratic South Africa. And this was something that was kind of sort of largely associated with policing during the apartheid era, as we know that it was a time when violence was normalized in as a form of control and as a form of containing communities, particularly those who fell within a certain demographic, whether looking at it from a class point of view or from a racial point of view. Um, and some of the incidences that would crop up already, if we speak to this, would be, of course, your Sharpeville massacre that happened in 1960. If we look at June, or the events around June 1976, if we look at a lot of the cases that came up that were linked to the level of torture and deaths in custody and detention, of the members of the liberation struggle and how the apartheid government and apartheid state dealt with those individuals. But we also know that this was not only limited to that, but we do know that, the targets of police violence were not just the opponents of the apartheid state. And now, one of the major issues is that if we see this recurring violence, there was an assumption in the sense that when we moved into a new democracy, that it would be something that would be left in our past. But sadly, we still see that it is still quite a major problem. Um, and this is why you have bodies such as IPID, which is the Independent Police Investigative Directorate, which was created with the aim of having an independent and sort of impartial body that would be effective in investigating and having a general oversight over what the South African police was doing in terms of in all the different communities. So it was a big and integral part of the post apartheid reform that would be implemented to just ensure that that the police are still committed to their policies and are still committed to serving the communities in the way that they should. Now, let's look at some of the statistics that they've provided us in terms of any sort of complaints that have been recorded in relation to police actions in democratic South Africa. Now, first of all, if we look at the period between April 2012 to March 2019, this is when this body became known as IPID. Those first 7 years of operation, there was a number of about 26,590 complaints of assault, 5,991 complaints relating to the unlawful discharge of an official firearm, and 1,078 complaints of torture, and about 844 cases of rape by a police officer that were recorded during this time. And if you just look at the recorded deaths as a result of police action during that time, it was recorded to be standing at about 3,182 deaths in 2,806 incidents. But let's compare that to the body under the when it was initially created in 1997 under the name the Independent Complaints Directorate. And during those 15 years in which it was operating, from April 97 to about March 2012, it the ICD recorded about 6,849 deaths as a result of police action. So these stats can already tell you that clearly violence, even committed by police officers, is still something that is endemic in the South African society. If we have to think about some of the cases that are more prominent, we could mention a brutal and notorious incident such as the case of the Marikana massacre, where on the 16th of August 2012, the police shot at more than 100 striking mine workers, killing 34 of them at the Marikana Platinum Mine in Northwest Province. And this incident did lead to the establishment of a commission of inquiry, but really little attention has been given to addressing these issues of misuse of force by police. And it's something that continues to be highlighted. For instance, if we then, fast forward to uh, 2020, 2021, during this recent lockdown as a result of the COVID pandemic, we can see that there are also more stats that reveal this issue that indicate that during that, even just that first 40 days of that lockdown that started, there was about 376 complaints against members of the police department, and metro cops relating to the enforcement of how the lockdown was uh, was 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 brought about. Um, this figure also would include, about 10 reports of lockdown related deaths as a result of police action. So we would then say that during that time, IPID had received about 32% more complaints against the police when compared to around the same time in the previous year before lockdown was affected. And we also do know that during lockdown, there was the deployment of the South African National Defence Force, which was there in support of SAPS to assist in enforcing the lockdown. And there were a lot of major incidences of alleged brutality involving SANDF members. Um, some of the more notorious ones we'll speak to is, for instance, the issue or the notorious case of Collins Khoza. And this took place on 10th April 2020, in which a resident of Alexandra Township in Johannesburg, not far from Sandton, died shortly after being assaulted by SANDF members. Um, and when you assess and you analyze the affidavits that were presented as part of the court application, it was alleged that the SANDF members, they were the ones who choked him, who slammed him against the cement ceiling, or rather cement wall and steel gate, hit him, kicked him, punched him in the face, in the stomach, and the ribs. Now, I'd like us to take a look at some of the other incidences that have been related to policing during lockdown or any sort of police misconduct. And it's already quite clear that there are certain subgroups who seem to be at a greater risk of violence than others, for instance, such as homeless people, such as migrants, such as even queer people. For instance, let's take the case of queer sex worker Alma Robin Monsumi, who died in police custody. And it's claimed that she died due to a suicide. She was arrested on the 9th of April for a suspected drug possession. 2 days later, she complained of not feeling very well. And then on the 12th of April, there was an ambulance that was called to come to the station, and then she was declared dead. And even the preliminary investigation that was conducted by IPID does very little to kind of let us in terms of what was the series of events that took place before she was declared to be dead. And if you look at other cases, there's also a lot of different cases that also show you in terms of how policing sometimes in South Africa continues to happen without impunity. There's also the case of Adane Emmanuel, which also brings to the fore or requires us to have a closer look at what nationality does for how policing is conducted, and also how foreign nationals and migrants can often be quite affected and be vulnerable in the face of policing systems in various countries, including here in South Africa, a country that is known to have widespread xenophobic attacks, such as the ones in 2019, that really sparked a lot of xenophobic violence instigated upon foreign nationals. So, in the case of Adana Emmanuel, he is an Ethiopian shopkeeper in Durban, and he was accused of selling cigarettes. This led to a sort of back and forth between him and the police officers, to which it led to the officers brutally assaulting him. He was then arrested and kept in police custody for about 2 hours before he was released on bail. And then the police then drove him to a clinic, which is where he died. Now let's shift the focus a little bit and let's stay within the region, but let's cast a look on the one of the last monarchies that exist globally, and that is the Kingdom of Eswatini. And we're going to look at all the events that have been taking place there in the context of a pandemic, and in the context of a global Black Lives Matter movement, in the context of repression that's been taking place there, and also some of the violence and the tactics that have been used by the police of Eswatini against citizens. And First of all, if we actually look at how Eswatini has amended the 2008 Suppression of Terrorism Act in 2017, and also have improved their provision for public gatherings in the 2017 Public Order Act, it still seems to be that public protests seems to be largely restricted, and freedom of expression still seems to be largely restricted in Eswatini. Um, because even though the right to peacefully protest still exists within the constitution and as an obligation under international and regional human rights law, there has been a lot of claims of how the Eswatini police has been reacting to protests, has been reacting to how communities and citizens have been standing up, speaking against police brutality. And what we would like to do first is maybe let's take a look at some of the background behind how this came about. And some of the events leading up to these protests start with Zweli Martin Dlamini, who is the editor of Swaziland News, in about February of 2020, being arrested for the claim of publishing articles which criticize King Mswati III. And according to his words, he claims to have been tortured while in custody at Mbabane Police Headquarters. He was released without charge 6 hours later, and that's when he fled to South Africa the following day. It was then later that the police raided his house in April of 2020 and arrested his wife, demanding to know where his whereabouts are. And some of the claims allege that she was tortured by police officers while she was in their custody. Then you have the case of Mandla Mazia in 2020, who's a security guard who worked for Securoscope Security. It's claimed that he was allegedly suffocated and killed by the Royal Eswatini Police while in police custody. And this is in relation to an investigation over a ton of sugar that went missing. And now you have one of their citizens who died in their custody due to this investigation. Then you have the case of Ayanda Dlamini. She's a woman who was arrested in April of 2020 after she demanded an investigation into her son's disappearance during the Ingwala ceremony. So Ayanda was detained at the Nhlangano prison, where she also claims she was allegedly tortured. And the claim is that the police accused her of being part of a group of people who burned down a house where the community suspected that the child that she's looking for was last seen. And there have also been more recent incidences, such as the one that sparked a lot of protests in Eswatini, that of Tabani Ngomonye, who is a 25-year-old law student at the University of Eswatini who mysteriously died, allegedly at the hands of the Royal Eswatini Police, between the time of 8th and the 9th of May 2021. It seemed that after he was killed, allegedly killed, they then towed his car to a nearby police station. His body was then found by family members on the 13th of May, dumped in the bushes nearby, just meters from where the police claimed to have found his car, that they claim was in a car accident. It was the same police that then circulated a notice requesting members to come forward to assist locate him and locate his car, despite the fact that the car was already in their possession. Um, his death was then what resulted in a wave of protests from youth, from human rights activists, from academics, members of parliament as well, and even local NGOs in Eswatini. And this was as a plight to demand the end to police brutality, to torture and ill treatment and unlawful killings of citizens. It was then during Tabani's memorial service on the 21st of May 2021, within this peaceful protest that was organized by various youth groups around this issue of police brutality, the Royal Eswatini Police proceeded to allegedly also fire tear gas and rubber bullets at peaceful protesters. What's also happening in Eswatini is the arrest of two pro-democracy MPs and the news of a third MP being sought in terms of them being arrested under the charge of terrorism. according to some activists that have given media information in terms of some of the developments in Eswatini. But in closing, looking at both the case of Eswatini and South Africa regarding policing, it's clear that there seems to be a lack of accountability in how the police conduct themselves. And what has also come to the fore is the ways in which citizens have been trying to create their own forms of justice, some of which being what would be largely criticized as citizen journalism, even though it's critiqued quite a lot. That has been helpful in citizens kind of providing visual evidence that can't be marred by political rhetoric. That exposes some of the issues around these forms of activities by police departments and by police themselves. And so these mediums that have been used to capture events have been helpful in bringing another dynamic and another voice to how society is being plagued by the issue of policing. Um, and it's allowed for this different narrative to almost emerge through the platforms of social media and through the fact that it has been a call for accountability on the parts of police departments and policing to really be critiqued. As we know that one of the indicators that we can look at just to assess the impact of whether policing is really being effective is looking at in the investigative agencies to see what is the rate of the criminal convictions that have resulted from certain investigations. Um, and even though it has been suggested that IPID has had more of an impact than its predecessor, there's still a lot of instances that show that there's still lack in terms of the number of convictions that are successful and that have resulted in a sort of proper way of dealing with policing in the region. And now we take it to you guys to say, please comment on this topic. Tell us what you think. What do you think have been the issues around your communities in terms of ill treatment of citizens and unlawful acts by police departments and police officers? And how do you think that as communities and as a country and even as a region, can we start to think about how we can deal with the issue of policing and misconduct by police departments?